equal rights, and self-determination of peoples, among others. These and other lofty purposes and principles enshrined in the Charter could only be achieved through multilateral cooperation. Unilateralism is antagonistic both to peace and to justice. Number two, sovereign equality of states is the basic tenet of the United Nations system. This is based on the core principle of self determination of every nation, according to which they are entitled to decide their own identity. The prohibition of the use of threats or force and peaceful settlement of disputes, as well as non intervention in the internal affairs of other countries, are all purposed to protect sovereign nations from foreign aggression and to secure friendly relations among them. Unilateralism negates the United Nations' basic tenets and fundamental principles. Unilateralism is an invitation to injustice, confrontation, and war. Number three, the United Nations, as the greatest symbol of multilateralism, is exposed to woes of unilateralism. Regrettably, the Security Council has been abused by certain permanent members for their self centered political or strategic agendas. On the one hand, they have leveraged the Council to exert pressure on other independent sovereign states and paralyze the same body from taking any acts to stop aggression and breach of the peace by their allies. Again, a very outstanding example is the United States' decades long vetoing of any meaningful decision to stop the Israeli regime's persistent genocide against Palestinians and its frequent aggressions against nations of the region. I wish to emphasize that Iran's support to and solidarity with the resistance groups in the region is legitimate under international law and aims to end aggression and occupation in our region. Resistance in itself serves as a response to unilateralism and the biased support extended to the Israeli occupying regime, which is committing acts of genocide in Gaza and Palestine. Number four, multilateralism entails respect for the division of mandates among UN organs. The Security Council's encroachment on issues beyond its mandate risks the integrity of the Charter as an international treaty. According to Article 25 of the Charter, the Council's power is not limitless or arbitrary. It cannot override customary international law and international treaties. The unjust resolutions imposed against Iran during 2006 to 2010, based on unfounded claims by the United States about Iran's peaceful nuclear program, were in clear violation of Iran's rights under NPT and at the cost of my people's fundamental human rights. Those responsible for these unlawful sanctions cannot evade accountability for the suffering inflicted on my people. So they cannot evade responsibility in this regard. Number five, unilateral coercive measures in the form of extraterritorial sanctions still continue to showcase a blunt, inhumane manifestation of radical unilateralism. The United States and its Western allies that reinforce those sanctions must be held accountable for untold sufferings, death, and destruction they have caused on the targeted nations, including my own people. Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, the Islamic Republic of Iran has consistently demonstrated its commitment to multilateralism, with a clear example being its constructive contribution to the conclusion of the JCPOA. This successful multilateral initiative addressed an unwarranted crisis and unfounded concern from the West regarding Iran's peaceful nuclear program, aiming to lift the illegal and unjust sanctions imposed on the Iranian nation. However, this multilateral process encountered a significant challenge due to the unilateral actions of the United States and its allies. The U.S. unilateral and unlawful withdrawal from the agreement exemplified unilateralism in the international arena, causing harm to all parties involved. Equally important, Iran's good neighborliness policy highlights the importance of multilateralism in resolving common concerns and challenges. In this context, Iran pursues regional dialogue and cooperation to create an environment where resources can be devoted to the progress and development of the region for the benefit of all. Strengthening partnerships and cooperation for collective security and sustainable development in the region will be the cornerstone of the Islamic Republic of Iran's foreign policy. Mr. President, in conclusion, I would like to emphasize the new approach and foreign policy of the president elect of the Islamic Republic of Iran, which focuses on strengthening multilateralism in accordance with the purposes and principles of the UN Charter and international law. His Excellency Dr. Pezeshkian, the president elect of the Islamic Republic of Iran, recently outlined his primary foreign policy strategy, which aims to open new horizons and foster friendly relations with other nations based on dialogue, cooperation, equality, and mutual respect. This strategy places particular importance on neighboring countries and the broader region, as well as on maintaining constructive relations with other states. Mr. President, as Mr. Secretary General has underlined, global challenges could be solved only through respect for international law, adherence to global commitments, and adoption of appropriate frameworks of multilateral governance. The Islamic Republic of Iran echoes these calls and welcomes any initiatives to further promote respect for international law. Multilateralism is key in this regard. Multilateralism is key in this regard. We believe this is the only way to establish a safe, just, and inclusive environment where all nations can enjoy sustainable peace and development. Thank you for your attention.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Bagheri, and I give the floor to the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Kuwait, His Excellency Mr. Abdullah Ali Al Yaha.
In the name of Allah, most gracious, most merciful, Your Excellency, Minister Sergei Lavrov, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the friendly country of the Russian Federation, President of the Security Council, Your Excellency, peace, mercy, and blessings of Allah be upon you. At the outset, I would like to congratulate you, Mr. President, and your friendly country on your presidency of the Security Council for this month. We hope that your presidency will contribute to the promotion and maintenance of international peace and security, and that your efforts will translate the visions and aspirations of all peoples of the world in order to support the effort for stability and the basis for international interaction in our foreign relations. I will also wish to express our appreciation for your convening of this first of its kind meeting to engage all in a direct and constructive dialogue in order to assess the existing international order, study all the dimensions, and push for achieving aspirations of the peoples of the world. Mr. President, as the eighth decade since the establishment of the UN and the entry into force of its charter draws to a close, we reaffirm the importance of the international community's renewed commitment to the purposes and principles of the charter, which is the cornerstone of joint international action and the basis for strengthening international cooperation in line with the changes and ramifications witnessed in the world over the past years, thus enabling us to face international challenges through creative and innovative policies that keep pace with changes and ensure a favorable environment for our relations, work, and international cooperation. In spite of all those challenges and obstacles facing the work of our ancient organization, the UN remains the most accepted, credible, and legitimate international multilateral mechanism in the field of joint international action. Its charter and its principles and purposes remain a clear framework and a main point of reference for defining and developing relations among nations and states, and a solid basis for our joint action. Hence, now more than ever, we need to review our assessments and priorities to strengthen all the means aimed at developing our common action. The state of Kuwait renews its call for the reform of the Security Council as one of the main pillars of the comprehensive reform process of the UN. The state of Kuwait also supports all efforts to achieve a comprehensive and genuine reform of the Security Council so that it may be more capable and effective in facing our current challenges in a more representative, transparent, impartial, and credible manner. Mr. President, the political, humanitarian, and health crises that the world has witnessed over the past 2 decades, as well as crises in food and energy security, the challenges of climate change, the spread of poverty, the threats to international peace and security, and the achievement of development goals. All these crises and other transboundary crises have served as a severe test for our multilateral world order. They have made clear the urgent need for strong, effective world order based on partnership and solidarity at the international level, based on the fundamental values and principles of multilateralism as regulated by international law and international UN legislation that we have all accepted. In light of global challenges that require concerted efforts to address them, small states must play a pivotal role in addressing these challenges as a necessity. In this context, we also count on developed states to play a leading role that contributes to the creation of a more equitable and balanced partnership and to fulfill their agreed upon commitments in support of the development in the least developed countries through technology transfer, debt relief, including ODA. And in line with the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, as well as take into consideration the development variables in order for developing states to not be left behind, especially in the global mainstream, particularly those facing special situations within the framework of new development and financing partnerships consistent with national priorities. In closing, I would like once again to commend your cooperation and that of the permanent mission of the Russian Federation to the UN in conducting the work of the Security Council for this month. We hope that these discussions will continue on the reform of the current world order so that it would be more stable, sustainable, just in the long term. May the peace and blessings of Allah be upon you.
Я благодарю его превосходительство.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Al Yahya for his statement, and I give floor to the Deputy Minister for Foreign Affairs of Belarus, His Excellency Mr. Yuri Ambrazevich. Mr. President, distinguished members of the Security Council, ladies and gentlemen, allow me to congratulate the Russian Federation on its presidency and wish it success in fulfilling this extremely important role in multilateral diplomacy. We would like to note the exceptional importance of the topic of today's discussion. Indeed, next year, the world will be marking the 80th anniversary of the end of the Second World War, the bloodiest and most devastating conflict in human history. The witnesses of that war and the great minds of that era, when they created the United Nations Charter as a document that embodied the ideals of universal engagement, solidarity, and respect for the sovereign equality of states, as a document that reflected the ideals of truly shared responsibility and indivisible security, as an instrument for multilateral, inclusive solutions to global problems. When they created it, they could not have imagined that the long journey of their ideals from a de facto bipolar world through a moment of unipolarity and towards a future multipolarity would leave us today not only to the minimization of multilateralism in international affairs, but also to the brink of a third world war. The desire to maintain its hegemony, the unwillingness to recognize the legitimate security interests and concerns of its neighbors and other actors, the pursuit of unilateral advantages in access to resources, and the desire to take unfair advantage of its dominant economic position have led the West, seemingly intoxicated by the euphoria of its unipolar moment and its elites, to an outcome that it seems it hadn't predicted itself. The West was not able to spearhead multilateralism as a true leader might have done. Instead, Western elites attempted to maximize their advantages to exploit others. And resistance to this has led to increased tensions across the world, to a rise in conflicts, to the deterioration of the international security architecture, of confidence building measures of arms control. It has led to confrontation to a greater or lessened degree with a part of the international community, and even to war in Europe. We are witnessing Western elites' conscious rejection, Western elites represented by NATO, conscious rejection of multilateralism in addressing crises, and their reliance on confrontation with those who have they identified as competitors, adversaries, and threats. Moreover, we're witnessing not just the West's rejection of multilateralism, but its rejection of bilateral international cooperation. Instead, the West is choosing to force others to engage on terms it imposes and rules it imposes. Just consider the veritable war unleashed by Poland on the border with Belarus against migrants from the south, with dozens killed and hundreds maimed by Polish security forces. Yet, despite our persistent proposals, Warsaw has completely refused to cooperate with Minsk through legal assistance and border management tools, while knowing perfectly well that only joint efforts will allow to effectively fight against criminals exploiting unfortunate migrants who are on their way from their home countries to Western Europe and primarily to Germany. Or take Lithuania's deliberate ban on the transit of Belarusian fertilizers through Lithuanian ports to African and Asian countries, or Vilnius's rejection of Minsk's willingness to arrange transit of Ukrainian grain to those same countries. We should also mention EU member states' ban on flights to the Republic of Belarus in this list is the first, second, third, and fourth not directed not only against Belarus, but also against the interests of many other states and ordinary people. We can cite many more examples of this. One gets the impression that while still being globally involved in the international agenda, Western states are increasingly limiting themselves and depriving themselves of instruments of influence. Is this not a rejection of multilateralism? The focus on unipolar actions and one-sided benefits and dictating one's own rules. This is the root of the problems of today's world. This trend, however, is countered to what we see in Greater Eurasia, which is a unifying agenda in a number of formats, including the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the Commonwealth of Independent States, the Eurasian Economic Union, ASEAN, and other regional associations operating in this area. These associations are not directed against someone. They're not directed against the West. But as has already been noted, it is the West itself that is unwilling to cooperate with them. Recognizing this situation, last year, Belarus organized a high-level international conference on Eurasian security, reality, and prospects in a transforming world in Minsk. In addition to our peace efforts to achieve the Minsk agreements, and in addition to our unifying initiatives in order to build a new security architecture in Europe entitled Helsinki 2, on the global topic of on the global spirit of a security dialogue in the spirit of San Francisco. At the Minsk conference last year, Belarus launched a discussion on building an equal and indivisible Eurasian security architecture. It is revealing that the overwhelming number of Western states who were invited ignored that invitation. It seems that true multilateralism will be revived among truly like-minded people and participants. During that conference, Belarus put forward an initiative to develop a European Charter of Diversity and Multipolarity in the 21st century. We envision this charter as a unifying document which will formulate the parameters and principles for the functioning of security architecture in Eurasia, as well as a strategic vision of multipolarity and multilateralism of the revitalized system of international relations, perhaps not only in Eurasia, but in the whole world. For us, these principles are clear and evident. They are, above all, reliance on international law, strict observance of the principle of the indivisibility of security, respect for the diversity of the development paths of all states, equal cooperation of all members of the international community, enhancing the role of the UN, making full use of regional associations, organizations, and integration mechanisms, and of course, returning to a truly effective multilateral cooperation. Further discussions on this topic will be held at the second Minsk conference on Eurasian security at the end of October and beginning of November of 2024. I thank you for your attention. I thank His Excellency, Mr. Ambrzejewicz, for his statement, and I now give the floor to the Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs of Thailand, His Excellency, Mr. Ras Jalichandra.
Mr. President, I would like to thank the Russian Federation for organizing this meeting. Thailand welcomes this open debate because we are committed to multilateralism. I wish to make 4 points as follows. First, the increasing number of conflicts worldwide require a more inclusive, resilient, and effective multilateralism, with the United Nations at its core. The lack of inclusive and transparent discussions often leads to differing perception and mistrust. Diplomacy and dialogue are key to avoid further confrontation and escalation of violence. The United Nations convening power should be leveraged to bring all sides together to work on sustainable and peaceful solutions. The forthcoming summit of the future will be an opportunity for all states to redesign the UN that is capable of addressing current and future global challenges. Second, to ensure that multilateralism with the United Nations at its core will continue to be relevant, the reform of United Nations, particularly the Security Council, is important. The Council should be reformed in such a way that reflects broader geographical representation, cross-regional balance, and greater representation of developing countries. But a more representative council is not enough. How the Security Council makes its decisions is also important. Thailand shares the view of the majority of the United Nations member states that a veto right is not a privilege, but an international responsibility. At a very minimum, all members of the Security Council should agree to refrain from blocking any draft resolution intended to prevent
transparency engagement that transparency and confidence building strengthen safety and security, improve sustainability, and continue to better confidence and understanding among states and peoples. I want to believe that upcoming summit of the future will open a new charter in which we shall renew mutual confidence and achieve greater understanding and solidarity, creating prospects for safer and better future. In conclusion, Mr. President, I want to point again to Serbia's full commitment to values of multilateralism contained in the United Nations Charter. It is important that we continue to work together to redefine and harmonize multilateralism with contemporary multipolar world in order to respond in a proper way to current as well as future crises and challenges. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank Serbia for your statement. And once again, I want to remind all speakers of the need to limit your statements to 3 minutes so that the council can complete its work on time. After 3 minutes, you'll see a light begin to flash on the microphone of the speaker, indicating that it's time to complete your statement. Now I give the floor to Morocco. Thank you very much, Mr. President. Allow me to first of all congratulate you on convening this open debate under your presidency, which is another opportunity for UN member states to reaffirm their full and constant commitment to promoting multilateralism towards a more just, prosperous, and fair world. Order and justice are essential. They're two faces of the same coin. A global world order without justice is impossible, but it's also essential to respect the UN Charter. Otherwise, peace will not be sustainable. The establishment of a new world order that answers that reflects the aspirations of the peoples of the world requires good governance, so that our common actions are in harmony with our international commitments. With this in mind, it is crucial to ensure a fair representation of national and collective interests of states that promote their participation in the international decision making, so that their disputes are resolved equitably in the framework of international law. Furthermore, a just international order requires true opportunities for socioeconomic development of member states without leaving anyone on the sidelines as part of sustainable development for all. Mr. President, the holding of the Summit of the Future in September will be a milestone for multilateralism. The implementation of the engagements that derive from it will be an opportunity for renewed and revitalized multilateralism based on the UN system that promotes international cooperation to confront the challenges that we face, in particular in the climate, energy, security sphere, as well as violent extremism and terrorism. The Kingdom of Morocco would like to highlight the need to continue efforts to re-energize the General Assembly and reform the Security Council so that it continues to be in harmony with current challenges. We have an opportunity before us to reaffirm our attachment to the UN, to take the opportunity for the UN as a bastion of multilateralism through respect of national sovereignty, territorial integrity of states, good neighborly relations, non-interference in internal affairs of states, and peaceful resolution of disputes. The Kingdom of Morocco advocates in favor of an effective, inclusive, preventive, and cooperative multilateralism, which works towards solidarity among states for the achievement of the 3 pillars of the UN: peace, security, development, and human rights. On this point, South-South cooperation, in particular with African countries, is a fundamental pillar of Moroccan foreign policy, in line with the guidelines of His Majesty Mohammed VI. The multilateralism to which we aspire is a multilateralism of intercultural, intercivilizational, and interreligious and intergenerational dialogue. Lastly, to conclude, I would like to reaffirm that the Kingdom of Morocco will remain an active and responsible partner, respecting the principles of the UN Charter and the achievement of its goals. Thank you very much, Mr. President. I thank the representative of Morocco for your statement, and I give the floor to Egypt.
سيد الرئيس أنقل لك
Mr. President, I convey to you the greetings of the Foreign Minister of Egypt, Dr. Badr Abdel Ati, who unfortunately was not able to come to this meeting due to previous commitments. I thank you for organizing this open debate that addresses an issue that is of paramount importance, especially as we're approaching the Summit of the Future, which at its core is about the future of the United Nations and the multilateral global order. We are now at a crossroads. We have to address the shortcomings that have marred the multilateral system on which our world today is based. It is evident that the international system that was established in the wake of the Second World War is no longer able to respond to the needs and complexities of a world that is rapidly changing, no longer fit for a present and a future that is moving steadily towards multipolarity, where the countries of the South are playing an ever more important role. The security and geopolitical challenges, the prevailing polarization politically, in addition to economic challenges, climate change, and other challenges, all these factors should prompt us to work together more effectively towards an international system that is capable to respond to the needs of today. In this context, we have to pose certain questions and find answers that maybe will help us become more aware and fathom the needs of the world. The world is expecting a lot from this organization, from the international system, especially the new generations that grew up in a very different world. I would like to address briefly two important aspects. It is very important to closely examine those two aspects if we are to find solutions to make the multilateral system more just, democratic, and sustainable. One, the developments that we've seen in the Middle East over the past 10 months prove that our world today needs new arrangements for collective security that reflects the reality and that makes the UN more responsive to the current political and security challenges. In this council, we speak a lot of the Charter of the United Nations, the importance of the Charter, the importance of adhering to the principles on purposes of the Charter, promoting the Charter. However, the recent developments, especially the unjust Israeli aggression since the 7th of October 2024, targeting Palestinian civilians in Gaza, have proven that when many speak of the Charter, the principles of international law, protecting civilians, human rights, these are arguments and claims that fail the test, especially as many have been applying double standards when it comes to addressing the behavior of Israel, the aggressive behavior of Israel towards our region. The developments in Gaza, the continued Israeli aggression amid shameful silence by the international community, threatens the multilateral system, threatens the UN as a whole, as we're witnessing double standards. This august council has failed in stopping the continued killing of the Palestinian people in Gaza. This prompts us to renew our call to reform this council so it becomes more representative, more just, more democratic. Egypt has always called for enhancing African representation in the Council, according to the Azawini Consensus and the Third Declaration. We've called for granting Arab countries the representation that is commensurate with the magnitude of Arab issues on the agenda of the Council. It is important for the Council also to hone and improve its methods of work so that they become more transparent and ensure more participation from other states. It is also important to enter into dialogue with other groupings and regional organizations, especially as the role of these groupings is becoming more important. They are now expressing the voice of the countries of the South, for instance, the BRICS countries. Second, it is no use to speak about a multilateral global system that is more just, democratic, and sustainable without speaking of reforming the global financial system, which is also unfit for the times. This issue is one of the most important challenges facing us today. We have to find effective solutions to this issue. Without those solutions, we will not be able to achieve comprehensive economic development, and it would not be possible to bridge the vast gaps between the countries of the North and countries of the South. We would also not be able to achieve the SDGs, on whose importance we all agreed. The Summit of the Future in September is an opportunity to take effective measures in this regard. We will be confirming the role that the United Nations must play in order to reform the financial architecture, including reforming the financial institutions, such as the IMF, and it is important to enhance cooperation on taxes and debt restructuring. In conclusion, Mr. President, if we do not use this moment to bring about a radical change in the multilateral system, and most notably the United Nations, which lies at its core, we will have to face a new reality where this organization would lose its relevance, its credibility, where our countries would lose one of the most important tools to maintain international peace and security. It would be very hard to imagine any promising future for multilateral action. Once again, I thank Russia for holding this important meeting. We look forward to our discussions that would elicit important ideas. I thank you, Mr. President.
Я благодарю Египет за их
I thank Egypt and I give the floor to Indonesia.
Thank you, Mr. President. We thank the Russian Federation for convening this timely open debate on a very important issue. Our multilateral system is being debilitated from the inside. The basic principle of the system is being put aside. International agreements, rules, laws are regularly being broken. Dialogue is being replaced by a take it or leave it approach. Solidarity being replaced by the mighty takes all approach. Consensus has become rarer than the Tanzanite gemstone. Double standard has often become the order of the day. This trend is disheartening and dangerous. We are failing the people we serve on upholding peace and security, saving lives in conflict situations, protecting human rights, ensuring development, protection of the environment of our children and our children's children. If we remain indifferent, we will be accomplices to the fall of multilateralism. And if multilateralism fails, a more peaceful, prosperous, and just world will be a distant dream. In this context, I would like to convey 2 points. First, it is time to recommit to the principles of multilateralism. Principles of inclusivity, equality, solidarity, partnership, and trust building must always guide us, with the UN Charter and international law as our beacon of light. We must avoid any abuse of power from the mighty, as it will create distrust and sharpen fragmentations. Second, we must seize the opportunity to reform our multilateral system to be more fit for purpose. We must stop the Security Council from being paralyzed in addressing humanitarian catastrophe in many conflict situations. The Council decision-making process must be brought back from the Stone Age. We need to expedite reform of the Council to be more effective, efficient, democratic, transparent, and accountable. A Security Council that is well adapted to the new global realities is the very tenet of a strong multilateral system. We must therefore use all avenues to reform the Council, including the Summit of the Future, if we want to prevent our future generation from the scourge of war. We must unite our strength and let multilateralism prevail. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank Indonesia for your statement, and I give the floor to Guatemala. Thank you, Mr. President. The Republic of Guatemala, as a founding member of this organization, firmly believes in multilateralism, and we would like to reaffirm that the United Nations is the central forum to address issues related to international cooperation, sustainable development, peace, security, human rights, and the rule of law. This is why among the principles of our foreign policy is a search for peaceful solutions to disputes based on dialogue, cooperation, and diplomacy. Collective security of humanity cannot nor should it depend on deterrence through the use or the threat of the use of nuclear weapons or any kind of other weapons that threaten future generations. Guatemala reiterates its firm determination to confront the existential threat represented by nuclear weapons for humankind, as well as for international law, international humanitarian law, and the United Nations Charter, and to maintain our commitment to their complete elimination and prohibition. Nuclear disarmament is a topic that we should all consider vitally important for the security of our hemisphere, for the world, and for the survival of humankind. Mr. President, a more just world order involves ensuring that all persons, especially the most vulnerable, have equitable access to basic rights such as education, healthcare, and security. This requires the elimination of all structural barriers that promote inequality. Multilateral cooperation can and must contribute to establishing international norms that promote equality and social justice in all nations. It's essential to work on strengthening multilateralism so that the United Nations is capable of responding to new challenges that threaten international peace and security in the framework of action based on respect for sovereignty and territorial integrity of states. It is necessary to have greater coherence in the implementation of the three pillars of this organization, and that it is essential to acknowledge that these three pillars are interrelated and mutually reinforcing. With this in mind, we'd like to reiterate our support for the new agenda for peace. We have a collective responsibility to strengthen respect for international law, since this is essential to maintain a just world order. We'd like to reaffirm the critical importance of compliance with the norms of international humanitarian law as a way of preventing and mitigating the human cost of international armed conflicts and internal conflicts, without, of course, forgetting about the responsibility to protect. It is unacceptable that healthcare facilities and educational facilities are a military target. Such attacks must be condemned in the strongest terms. Guatemala will continue advocating for preventive diplomacy and mediation and as means for avoiding the escalation of conflicts. As reaffirmed in the Declaration of Manila, all states have an obligation to resolve their international disputes through peaceful means such as negotiation, arbitration, and judicial arrangements. This council can and should benefit from greater interaction with membership and other organs of the UN, including the Human Rights Council. Furthermore, we maintain our firm support for the role of the Peacebuilding Commission and its integrated approach. From the point of view of my country, it's essential for the Security Council to take into account the different strategic instruments that could be used at the operational level in order to include the peacebuilding component in mandates of peacekeeping operations. To conclude, we urge all member states to strengthen their commitment to the UN Charter through the defense of its principles, such as refraining from the threat or the use of force, respecting territorial integrity, international law, and peaceful resolution of disputes. Thank you very much.
Я благодарю
I thank Guatemala for your statement, and before giving the floor to Nicaragua, I would like to inform members of the council that this will be the last statement for this morning's session. Nicaragua, you have the floor. Thank you very much, Mr. President. We'd like to congratulate the Russian Federation and its Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov, for the successful presidency during July. Nicaragua would like to endorse the statement made by Uganda on behalf of the Non-Aligned Movement and by the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela on behalf of the Group of Friends in Defense of the UN Charter. Nicaragua reaffirms that peace and multilateralism are fundamental principles for our peoples, in conformity with the United Nations Charter and international law. This is reflected in all our international relations and in our commitment to multilateralism. For peace, for true and just peace and security, it's important to ensure that the rights of peoples are reflected in the organization that represents us. We consider that in the face of growing interventionist actions by Western countries that threaten international peace and security, a new world order is more necessary than ever to ensure this peace and security in a new multipolar and polycentric world. We'd like to reiterate that this new order must be in line with the purposes and principles of the UN Charter, respecting the sovereignty, independence, the self-determination of peoples, and the non-interference in their internal affairs. These are essential requirements to achieve peace at the national and international level that we all yearn for. The inhumane and illegal unilateral coercive measures must be eliminated immediately to ensure stability, peace, and development of families, peoples, and nations. These measures are aggressions and the biggest obstacle for the implementation of the 2030 Agenda and the eradication of poverty. Mr. President, a new world order is being born. Empires have been weakened. An alternative poles of power are emerging based on of people's new mechanisms for integration and solidarity, such as those being promoted by the People's Republic of China and the Russian Federation, the peoples that have joined in the framework of BRICS, the peoples of Africa, Arab peoples. In spite of the multiple crises, a multipolar world is being born in this era, based on solidarity and the combat of all our peoples against old and new forms of imperialism, colonialism, and neocolonialism. Nicaragua will support the peoples of the global South in this yearning for a multipolar world, advocating for a stronger global solidarity that helps us accelerate the implementation of a more just, democratic, and sustainable world order. We're grateful once again to the Russian Federation for its leadership and contributions in creating this new multipolar world. Thank you very much. I thank Nicaragua for your statement. We still have a number of speakers on our list. With the agreement of members of the council, I will suspend this meeting until 3 p.m. The meeting is suspended.
draw the attention of council members to document S/2024/537, a letter dated July 9th, 2024, from the permanent representative of the Russian Federation to the United Nations, addressed to the Secretary General, transmitting a concept paper on the item under consideration. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as the Minister for Foreign Affairs of the Russian Federation. Ladies and gentlemen, Your Excellencies, today, the very foundations of the international legal order, strategic stability, and the UN-centric system of global politics are being put to the test. It will be impossible to resolve the conflicts that are multiplying without getting to their root causes and restoring faith in our ability to join forces for the common good and justice for all. Let us be frank, not all states represented in this room recognize the key principle of the UN Charter, the sovereign equality of all states. The United States has long, through the words of its presidents, declared its own exceptionalism. This also applies to Washington's attitude towards its allies, from whom it demands unquestioning obedience, even to the detriment of their national interests. Rule America. That is the essence of the notorious rule-based order, which is a direct threat to multilateralism and international law. The most important components of international law, the UN Charter and the decisions of our Council, are interpreted by the collective West in a perverse and selective manner, depending on what instructions are handed down from the White House. And many Security Council resolutions are outright ignored. These include Resolution 2202, which endorsed the Minsk agreements on Ukraine, and Resolution 1031, which endorsed the Dayton Agreement on peace in Bosnia and Herzegovina on the basis of the principle of equal rights for the three constituent peoples and two entities. The sabotage of resolutions on the Middle East can be discussed endlessly. It suffices to mention Anthony Blinken's statement in an interview with CNN in February 2021 in response to a question about what he thinks about the decision of the previous US administration to recognize the Syrian Golan Heights as belonging to Israel. And I will refresh your memory for those of you who may have forgotten. In response to that question, the Secretary of State said, leaving aside the question of legality, from a practical standpoint, the Golan Heights are very important to Israel's security, end of quote. And this, in spite of the fact that UN Security Council Resolution 497, which remains in force and which we are all very familiar with, qualifies Israel's annexation of the Golan Heights as illegal. However, according to those very rules, we should, to quote Anthony Blinken, leave aside the question of legality. And of course, everyone remembers the statement of US Permanent Representative regarding the fact that Resolution 2728 of March 25th, demanding an immediate ceasefire in the Gaza Strip, is not legally binding. In other words, these American rules are more important than Article 25 of the UN Charter. In the last century, George Orwell, in his story Animal Farm, already presaged the essence of this rule-based order. I quote, all animals are equal, but some are more equal than others, end of quote. If you fulfill and obey the will of the hegemon, you're permitted to do anything you wish, but if you dare defend your national interests, you will be declared a pariah and sanctioned. Washington's hegemonic policy has not changed for decades. Every Euro-Atlantic security arrangement, without exception, has been based on ensuring US dominance. This has included the subjugation of Europe and the containment of Russia. The main role in this was assigned to NATO, which eventually subjugated the European Union, which was presumably created for Europeans, and shamelessly privatized OSCE institutions in flagrant violation of the Helsinki Final Act. The reckless expansion of NATO, despite repeated warnings from Moscow over many years, also provoked the Ukrainian crisis, starting with the coup d'etat organized by Washington in February 2014 in order to establish full control over Ukraine with a view to preparing an offensive against Russia with the help of the neo-Nazi regime brought to power. When Poroshenko and then Zelensky were waging war against their own citizens in the Donbass, and were destroying Russian education, Russian culture, Russian media, and the Russian language in general through their legislation, and were banning the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, no one in the West batted an eye, nor did they demand that their wards in Kiev observe decency and refrain from violating international conventions on the right of national minorities, or the very constitution of Ukraine itself, which also contains these demands. It was precisely to eliminate threats to Russia's security and to protect those people who consider themselves part of Russian culture and who live on lands that had been settled by their ancestors for centuries, in order to save them from legislative and even physical extermination, that the special military operation was launched. It is telling that even now, when multiple initiatives on a Ukrainian settlement are being put forward, few people remember Kiev's violation of human rights and the rights of national minorities. None of these initiatives include these aspects. Only recently did EU documents on the beginning of negotiations regarding Ukraine's accession formulate a demand to this end, mainly due to Hungary's principled position. However, Brussels' actual capacity and desire to influence the Kiev regime is questionable. We call on all those who are genuinely interested in overcoming the crisis in Ukraine to ensure that their proposals take into account the key issue of the right of national minorities, all minorities without exception. Silence on this issue devalues peace initiatives, and the racist policy of Mr. Zelensky receives de facto approval. It is typical that 10 years ago in 2014, Zelensky said, if the people in the east of Ukraine and Crimea want to speak Russian, let them be, leave them alone, let them speak Russian legally. Language will never divide our homelands, end of quote. Since then, the US has successfully re-educated him, and as early as 2021, Zelensky, in one of his interviews, demanded that those who feel a sense of affinity with Russian culture get out and go to Russia for the future of their own children and grandchildren. I appeal to the masters of the Ukrainian regime, make sure that it complies with Article 1.3 of the UN Charter, which guarantees the fundamental rights and freedoms of all people without distinction of race, sex, language, or religion. Dear colleagues, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization is not content with the war that it has unleashed against Russia through the hands of the unlawful authorities in Kiev, nor is it content with the entire OSCE space. Having dismantled the fundamental agreements in the area of arms control, the US continues to ramp up confrontation. Recently, at the summit in Washington, the leaders of NATO countries reiterated their claim to a leading role not only in the Euro-Atlantic region, but in the Asia-Pacific region as well. The proclaimed intention is that NATO is continuing to be guided by the goal of protecting the territory of its member states. But in order to do this, they allegedly need to spread the alliance's dominance on the entire Eurasian continent and adjacent water. The military infrastructure of NATO is advancing into the Pacific region with the obvious goal of undermining the ASEAN-centric architecture, which for many decades was built on the basis of the principles of equality, recognition of mutual interests, and consensus. To replace the inclusive mechanisms around ASEAN, the US and its allies are building closed confrontational blocks such as AUKUS and other quartets and trios. Recently, the deputy head of Pentagon, Mr. Hicks, stated that the US and their allies must prepare for protracted wars, and not only in Europe. That is the end of the quote. In order to contain Russia, China, and other countries whose independent policies are seen as a challenge to its hegemony, the West is aggressively dismantling the global system that was originally built based on its models. Washington has done everything to blow up, including literally by organizing terrorist attacks on the Nord Stream gas pipelines, the foundations of mutually beneficial energy cooperation between Russia, Germany, and Europe as a whole. At the time, Berlin remained silent, but today we see another embarrassing period for Germany, whose leadership has unquestioningly complied with the US in order to place US medium-range missiles on its territory. Olaf Scholz said very ingeniously that the US has decided to place high-precision offensive weapons systems in Germany, and this is a good decision. And amidst all this, Mr. Kirby spoke, the expert on media spoke on behalf of the US president to say, we're not seeking to unleash a third world war. This would have horrific consequences for the European continent. A Freudian slip, as they say. Washington is convinced that if a new global war were to take place, it would be their European allies and not the US who would suffer. If that's the analysis on which Biden's strategy and Biden's administration strategy is based, this is a very dangerous illusion, and Europeans must become aware of the suicidal role that has been assigned to us. Americans are holding the entire West at gunpoint and expanding their trade and economic war with those they see as undesirable, having unleashed an unprecedented campaign of unilateral coercive measures that are hitting Europe first and are leading to a fragmentation of the world economy.
The countries of the global South, Asia, Africa, and Latin America are suffering from the neocolonial practices of the West. Illegal sanctions, multiple protection measures, restrictions on access to leading technologies are counter to true multilateralism and create serious obstacles to achieving the 2030 agenda. Where are all those attributes of the free market, where the United States and its allies taught everyone to follow? Market economy, fair competition, violability of private property, presumption of innocence, free movement of people, goods, and capital, all of that has been jettisoned. Geopolitics has buried the once sacred laws of the market for the West. Recently, we heard public demands from the officials of the United States, the European Union, aimed at China to reduce excess production in high-tech sectors because the West has started losing its long advantages in that area. Today, instead of market principles, we have the same rules. Colleagues, the actions of the United States and their allies are impeding international cooperation and the building of a more just world. They're taking entire countries and regions as hostages, are not allowing peoples to fulfill their sovereign rights enshrined in the UN Charter, and distracting from the necessary joint efforts to regulate conflicts in the Middle East, Africa, and other regions, and reducing global inequality, eliminating terrorism, drug trafficking, and famine, and other problems. Of course, I believe that it's with good faith it's possible to resolve these matters. In order to stop development following a negative scenario, we want to discuss steps in order to restore trust and stabilize the international situation. First of all, we need to deal with the root causes of the crisis that have unfolded in Europe. Conditions for establishing a stable peace in Ukraine have been set out by President Putin. I won't repeat them. A political, diplomatic solution must be accompanied by concrete steps to eliminate threats to the Russian Federation coming from the Western Euro-Atlantic direction. By agreeing to mutual guarantees and agreements, it will be necessary to take into account new geostrategic realities on the Eurasian continent, where continental architecture is being formed that is truly equal and indivisible. Europe risks falling behind from this objective historical process. We are ready to seek a balance of interests. Secondly, restoring regional and global balance of forces must be accompanied by active efforts to eliminate injustice in the global economy. In a multipolar world, there should not be any monopolists or in monetary regulation, trade, or technologies. The overwhelming majority of members of the international community share this view. It's very important to reform as soon as possible the Bretton Woods institutions and the WTO. Their activities should reflect the true weight of non-Western centers of development and growth. Thirdly, significant and qualitative changes must take place in other institutions of global governance if we want them to work for the benefit of all. First of all, this applies to our organization, which up to now, in spite of everything, well, continues to be the embodiment of multilateralism. It has a unique universal legitimacy and recognized broad range of authority. An important step to restoring the effectiveness of the UN would be a confirmation by all its members of their commitment to the principles of the UN Charter, not selectively, but in their fullness and interdependence. About which form this kind of reconfirmation could take place, we could think together. An important work is being done by the group of friends in defense of the UN Charter, established at the initiative of Venezuela. We invite all countries that still believe in the rule of international law to join this work. A key aspect of reforms of the UN must be changing the makeup of the Security Council, although this by itself will not lead to productive work unless there is a basic agreement on the methods of work among its permanent members. This thought, nevertheless, does not invalidate the need to eliminate geographic and geopolitical imbalances in the Security Council, where there's clear overrepresentation of the countries of the collective West today. What's been needed for a long time is to achieve a broad agreement on concrete parameters of reform, which will strengthen representation of Asia, Africa, and Latin America. It's also important to implement changes in the staffing policy of the Secretariat to eliminate the overrepresentation of nationals of the West and their subservient nations in the administrative structures of the organization. And the Secretary General and his staff, of course, must adhere strictly to the principles of impartiality and neutrality, as demanded by Article 100 of the Charter, which we are constantly reminding of. Fourth, strengthen the multilateralism in international relations must be done through other multilateral organizations, including the G20, which in which is represented most of the global majority and Western states. The mandate of the G20 is strictly limited to economic and development. So it's very important that a substantive dialogue on this platform is does not include short-sighted attempts to introduce geopolitical topics. An increasingly important role based on the principles of the UN Charter is played by BRICS and the Shanghai Organization for Cooperation. It includes countries that represent various regions and civilizations that are cooperating on the basis of equality, mutual respect, consensus, and mutual compromise. This is this global standard of multilateral cooperation with the participation of major powers. Of practical importance for multilateralism are such regional entities as the CIS, the Collective Security Treaty Organization, the Euro-Asian Economic Community, ASEAN, the League of Arab States, African Union, and CELAC. We see as an important task to develop multiple and diverse contacts between them, including with the support of the UN. The Russian presidency of the Council will devote a topic on its agenda to the Eurasian regional organizations. Colleagues, speaking at the Parliamentary Forum of the BRICS on the 9th of July in St. Petersburg, Vladimir Putin said that the formation of a world order that reflects a real balance of forces is a complex and in many ways, a painful process, end of quote. Discussions on this topic, we believe, must be developed without devolving into pointless polemics. They should be based on a sound analysis of all the range of factors. First and foremost, it's important to restore professional diplomacy, culture of dialogue, the ability to hear and to listen, maintain channels of crisis communication. Depending on whether politicians and diplomats can formulate something like a vision of the future, millions of lives will depend on them. Whether our world will be multilateral and just, it depends on member states. The foundation is the Charter of the United Nations. If everyone follows its letter and spirit, then the United Nations is capable of overcoming current divergences and to reach a common denominator on most issues. The end of history did not take place. Let's work together in the interest of the beginning of history of true multilateralism that reflects all the richness of cultural and civilizational diversity of the peoples of the world. I invite everyone to a frank discussion. Of course, it has to be an honest one. Thank you very much.
Your turn.
I resume my function as the President of the Council, and I now give the floor to Federal Counselor and Head of the Federal Department of Foreign Affairs of Switzerland, His Excellency Mr. Ignacio Cassis.
Monsieur le Président,
Mr. President, Excellencies, dear colleagues, a more just, more democratic, and more sustainable world order is one that places freedom at its heart. Yet history shows us that there is no such thing as absolute freedom. While freedom is essential for living in society, it is only guaranteed when it is protected by rules, rules of principle, and rules of law. The right to freedom cannot exist without duty and responsibility. More than 75 years ago, when we adopted the United Nations Charter and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, we drew lessons from the history of the first half of the 20th century, and particularly the two world wars. These universal standards made it possible to build a world in which the force of law would eventually prevail over the law of force. And it is in particular the prohibition of the use of force, a genuine paradigm shift in international law, when the world previously believed in the idea of a just war, that was placed at the heart of our charter. Since the adoption of the charter, we, the peoples of the United Nations, have stone by stone built the foundations of our universal commitments. And we have tried together to build a better world, one with less poverty, controlled epidemics, humanitarian assistance for those in need. Many of us were bathed in an optimism fueled by the spirit of never again. When the Berlin Wall came down, we believed that the ideals based on the principle of the Charter would take hold once and for all. But we must admit that we have not been able to stay the course. Our optimism clashed against the merciless wall of realism. And yet, we know that history is not linear, and that human beings have an unfortunate tendency to repeat the same mistakes. Protectionism, nationalism, symptoms of this global malaise illustrate a gigantic lack of trust between humans. Wars, poverty, misinformation, and geopolitical visions that are difficult to reconcile are gaining ground all over the world. Ukraine, for example, has been devastated by military aggression for over 2 years in flagrant violation of the Charter. For more than a year, Sudan has once again been in the grip of a civil war. And ladies and gentlemen, 75 years of multilateral engagement have yet to bring peace to the Middle East. Yes, multilateralism is ailing. If the United Nations seems too weak to us today, it is because it reflects the too little willingness on the part of all member states to obey the law of duty that they have voluntarily subjected themselves to. We must regain the momentum that has held our community together for so long. Mr. President, in May 2023, in this very chamber, I chaired a debate on the role of trust between states. Trust is a key element if this council is to fulfill its mandate. To build trust, we need to seek out more dialogue, especially when there are divisions. Seeking out and creating dialogue sometimes requires creativity and risk-taking. When we organized an international conference on peace in Ukraine a month ago, our aim was precisely to build trust through dialogue. In Switzerland, for 2 days, around 100 delegations discussed possible paths to peace. By no means did we all agree on these paths to peace, but we tried to establish a basis of trust on which to move forward. And we are providing a forum for other discussions, such as the one currently taking place on Sudan under the auspices of the UN Geneva, or the one that took place earlier in the context of Yemen. As the depositary of the Geneva Convention, Switzerland is ready to shoulder its responsibilities to achieve a world order based on humanitarian law. As we commemorate the 75th anniversary of the Geneva Conventions next month, and I hope to welcome you all to Switzerland for this important commemoration, it is high time to reaffirm the universal validity of international humanitarian law. At the end of October, Switzerland will host the 34th International Conference of the Red Cross and Red Crescent in Geneva. Under the motto, Managing Uncertainty, Strengthening Humanity, the aim of this conference is to improve humanitarian response through effective dialogue. Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, faced with an increase in wars and the systematic use of violence, we need to believe in respect for international humanitarian law. While trust can be created through dialogue, it can also be created through a change of perspective. As a doctor by training, I believe in science and scientific diplomacy. I'm convinced that science can help strengthen the efficiency of our work. An approach based on scientifically established facts also strengthens mutual trust. It makes it possible to anticipate risks and opportunities for peace. During our presidency of the Council in October of this year, we will be proposing a meeting on the potential of science diplomacy. Dear colleagues, it is up to us, the members of this Council, to live up to the responsibility that we have been entrusted, whether by the General Assembly or by the history of our common humanity. I thank you. I thank His Excellency, Mr. Ignacio Cassis, and I give the floor to the Director of the Department of Multilateral and Global Affairs, Ministry for Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation, and Ambassador to the Caribbean Community of Guyana, His Excellency, Mr. George Talbot.
Mr. President, Excellencies, I thank the Russian Federation for convening today's open debate and welcome the opportunity for collective introspection and frank assessment of multilateral cooperation in the interest of a more just, democratic, and sustainable world order. In Guyana's view, such an order is exactly what was envisaged when the United Nations Charter was crafted. The critical ingredients can be found in the preamble to the Charter. A world free from the scourge of war. One where there is respect for fundamental human rights and the dignity and worth of the human person. Where men and women and nations large and small enjoy equal rights. Where there is justice and respect for international law and the obligations flowing therefrom, and a world that fosters for all peoples better standards of life in larger freedom. The United Nations Charter, embodying as it does the fundamental principles of the multilateral ethos, has served as a framework and guide for the achievement of these objectives. It enjoins a sense of common purpose, a spirit of solidarity, and of inclusion. No country or people is to be left behind. As sovereign equals, every state deserves a seat at the table of global discourse. Each voice needs to be heard and respected, and each contribution valued. In the words of Guyana's most celebrated poet, Martin Carter, I quote, "All are involved, all are consumed," unquote. Small developing countries such as my own attach the highest value to an effective, democratic, responsive, and inclusive multilateral system, and to the primacy of the rule of international law. Our security, our very survival depends on this. In working to adapt the global architecture to the demands of the 21st century, the enduring relevance and validity of the purposes and principles of the UN Charter cannot be overstated. However, too often are they honored in the breach. It is incumbent on the Security Council, charged with the primary responsibility for maintaining international peace and security, and by extension, its member states, to be exemplary in their adherence to the Charter and to eschew any conduct that is inimical to the Council's mandate. But no state is exempt in this regard. States must therefore hold themselves and each other to the highest standards of performance and accountability in observance of the Charter and international law. Mr. President, as we have seen in the cases of Ukraine and Gaza, breaches of the peace can have consequences well beyond the immediate theater of operations. The Security Council must take active cognizance of these realities and, in concert with the broader international community and regional organizations, be more proactive in addressing the drivers of conflict. Greater attention to prevention and to the pacific settlement of disputes, as provided in Chapter 6 of the Charter, is imperative. Parties to disputes must be persuaded to seek solutions utilizing the means outlined in Article 33 of the Charter, including negotiation, mediation, arbitration, and judicial settlement. Too often is there recourse to the threat or use of force. The result is an increasing number of armed conflicts in our world today that continue to destroy lives and threaten the future of states. This is compounded by a lack of respect for international humanitarian law. In reaffirming the principle of non-interference in internal affairs, we cannot turn a blind eye to egregious violations. Members of the Security Council should not be among those undermining the judicial institutions of the United Nations, so crucial to ensuring respect for the rule of law and promoting accountability. Mr. President, the thrust towards a more just, democratic, and sustainable world order will of necessity entail institutional reform, not least of the Security Council, arguably the least representative of global institutions. The Council must be made more representative, democratic, and accountable. For Guyana, no reform would be complete without enhanced participation of small states, who for the most part are a force for peace and principle. Moreover, the multidimensional and interlocking threats and challenges of today require greater cooperation, complementarity, and coherence of effort across UN organs, international machinery, and member states. We must broaden our frame of reference and expand our toolkit to deal with the new threats that have evolved, such as those posed by climate change, cyber attacks, AI, disease, etc. Likewise, in the use of available resources to better address interlinked pursuits, such as between prevention and peace building and development and poverty eradication. Just a fraction of the vast resources dedicated to implements of war and destruction would more than suffice for the fight against poverty or hunger or disease or the combat of climate change. Indeed, for the promotion of sustainable peace in our world. Finally, on the question of trust among member states, within the Security Council, or wherever, this question is not new, nor is the answer. Trust is ultimately based on performance, the honoring of commitments, the assumption of responsibilities, the discharge of obligations. It is fostered by promoting real understanding and dialogue. Across the multitude of commitments, undertakings, and obligations, whether in the UN Charter, the 2030 Agenda, the Paris Agreement, or in the many other instruments, resolutions, and declarations adopted by these United Nations or beyond, a credibility gap exists that must be closed. I end, Mr. President, as the Charter begins. We the peoples. Their trust, their hopes, their aspirations, their expectations are ultimately what matters most. It must be acknowledged that the adversarial nature of contemporary politics makes it impossible to fulfill our global commitments and meet the expectations of our people. States must demonstrate by their actions that they are reliable and trustworthy partners committed to working together for the greater good of all. I thank you.
Я благодарю его.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Talbot for a statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Algeria.
Mr. President, Excellencies, first I thank Russia for organizing this open debate, and I thank His Excellency Sergei Lavrov for coming from Moscow to chair this important meeting. Excellencies, this debate is very timely. Timely because our Council continues to struggle to find solutions to too many conflicts and crises, including in Palestine, where genocide is being committed as we speak. I hope this debate will help our Council to be more effective and less polarized. Mr. President, multilateral cooperation is not something new. There were instances of multilateralism through military alliance, treaties, and trade routes in the Mediterranean region and elsewhere during ancient times. While this may not fit the modern definition of multilateral cooperation, it illustrates the idea of various entities coming together for common purposes. Today, we cannot imagine a world without multilateral cooperation. It is essential for addressing complex global issues that no single country can solve alone. It also allows governments to pool resources, share knowledge, and develop joint solutions. As Council's members, this is precisely what we try to do every time we enter this chamber. Mr. President, Multilateral cooperation faces multiple challenges. This requires the UN to adapt to emerging realities with multiple centers of power and to enhance its role in establishing a just, democratic, and sustainable international order. My delegation firmly believes that reforming the Security Council would increase the legitimacy of this UN organ. In this regard, expanding the Council's membership and prioritizing the historical injustice done to Africa will be a milestone. The open debate that will be held next month under the Sierra Leone presidency will allow us to discuss this issue further. In the meantime, the IGN's contribution to the Pact of the Future is an important step in the right direction. We thank the IGN's co-chairs, the permanent representative of Austria and Kuwait. Mr. President, regarding the opportunities we shall not miss, first and foremost, we have the 2030 Agenda. It represents a universal framework that addresses poverty, environmental degradation, and economic inequalities. And let's not forget that this agenda calls for the full realization of the right to self-determination of people living under colonial and foreign occupation. With less than 1/5 of the target on track, the world is failing to deliver on the SDGs promise. Urgent actions is needed. Excellencies, Algeria believes that to reestablish an atmosphere of trust in the UN, and in particular with this Council, we require more efforts to foster mutual respect, transparency, inclusivity, and openness. To that end, we must abide by and prioritize diplomacy and dialogue, transparency, mutual understanding, peaceful settlement of disputes. We also need to give priority to conflict prevention and peace building by addressing the root causes. Last but not the least, we need to uphold international law and the UN Charter as guiding principles. We must ensure that the Council's decisions and actions adhere to these principles and contribute to global peace and stability. Our compass shall be avoiding the selective application of international law. Dear colleagues, as the Summit of the Future approach, let's work to make this event a real Summit of the Future, not a Summit of the past. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Algeria for a statement, and I give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, President. The world of 2024 looks very different to the world of 1945, but the challenges we face are no less stark. More countries globally are engaged in conflicts than at any time since the Second World War. We're facing a climate crisis, and scientific and technological breakthroughs are raising new questions which we need to answer. A UN fit for the 21st century is vital to meet these challenges. I'd like to make 3 points. First, we need reinvigorated systems that are more inclusive and more responsive to deliver on these important priorities, including the Sustainable Development Goals and international financial architecture reform. That is why the UK is committed to making a success of the Summit of the Future in September and realizing its potential to set a new, ambitious course for the UN. We also recognize that members sitting around this table need to be more representative of the world today, and that is why we have long supported Security Council reform. Second, we need to ensure that this Council delivers on its mandate to uphold international peace and security. We regret that recent Council resolutions 2735 and 2736, calling for a ceasefire deal in Gaza and de-escalation in and around El Fasher in Sudan, have yet to be fully implemented. We call on all parties to do their utmost to see these resolutions implemented to prevent further human suffering. We as Council members also have a responsibility to uphold our own commitments. It is therefore vital that the Russian government stops sourcing weapons from DPRK in violation of UN Security Council resolutions and stops its attempts to disrupt UN work in Africa, including by stopping Russian proxies' targeted actions against MINUSCA. Third, we must defend the UN Charter. President, while you tell us how you believe the world order can become more just, democratic, and sustainable, your military is systematically bombing civilians in Ukraine in an unprovoked war of aggression and in flagrant violation of the UN Charter. What is just about trying to annex another country's land? What is democratic about trying to subjugate another country's people? What is sustainable about waging a war that has killed or injured over 500,000 of your own people? The war in Ukraine is a stark reminder of what kind of world order Russia really wants. A world where might is right and powerful countries can bully and invade others with impunity. The UK will not accept such a world. We will continue to stand staunchly behind Ukraine. We will support its aspiration for a just and lasting peace in line with the UN Charter and international law, and its demand for accountability. We will continue to be a tireless advocate for effective multilateralism and for the principles at the heart of the UN Charter. I thank you.
Благодарю.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom, and I give the floor to the representative of Sierra Leone.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank you for convening this timely debate on multilateral cooperation in the interest of a more just, democratic, and sustainable world order. Sierra Leone welcomes the debate not only in view of the forthcoming 80th anniversary of the United Nations, the most essential multilateral institution of our time, but also because it offers the opportunity to rethink and reshape our cooperation framework on the basis of equity, democracy, and sustainability. Today, more than ever, our collective efforts are essential in navigating the complexities of our interconnected world. The challenges we face, ranging from climate change to global health crisis, from conflict to economic inequalities, are beyond the capacity of any single nation to resolve. They demand a robust, coordinated, and inclusive multilateral approach. Currently, the 193 member states of the United Nations, from diverse regions and cultures, evoke a strong statement of recognition by member states of the importance of the multilateral system founded on international law to safeguard the sovereignty and independence of states, and to advance and defend common and critical interests. We should therefore resolve to use this unity in diversity to achieve the purposes of the organization, to maintain international peace and security, promote and protect fundamental human rights, and cooperate to achieve sustainable development. Presently, we are, however, challenged to generate innovative ideas and credible mechanisms that will bring all conflict to a peaceful end, maintain peace and security, promote social progress, human rights and fundamental freedoms, and secure better standards of life for humanity. We have limited options or any other alternative other than to strengthen multilateralism based on the UN Charter and international law to address these challenges. This Council should, in this regard, reflect on reform measures that will reinforce our collective obligation to uphold the purposes and principles upon which our organization was founded, as enshrined in the UN Charter. We cannot champion a just, democratic, and sustainable world when Africa, a continent on which more than half of the discussions of the Security Council are based, remains excluded in the permanent category and underrepresented in the non-permanent category in the organ with primary responsibility and binding decision powers on matters of international peace and security. The historical injustice against Africa must be addressed, and we look forward to the debate on this important issue during Sierra Leone's presidency of the Security Council in August. There is a binding commitment to build a global society that is more just, inclusive, and equal than the one we live in today. Accordingly, we must be committed to supporting and facilitating multilateral cooperation in the interests of a just, democratic, and sustainable world, with the United Nations at the center. Therefore, respecting the prohibition on the use of force, preserving and strengthening the values of peaceful settlement of dispute, upholding the dignity of humanity and meaningful sustainable economic development through international cooperation as enshrined in the UN Charter, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and reaffirmed in the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, are essential to promote and support the three pillars of the United Nations. Mr. President, on the basis of the foregoing, let me highlight 4 key points. First, and importantly, a just world requires an unwavering commitment to the rule of law. Respect for and upholding international law and the rule of law at the international level is a sine qua non, as it is self-evident that for multilateralism to be sustained and strengthened, it is imperative that states abide by their obligations under the UN Charter and international law, eschewing selective application of the law. To strengthen multilateralism through international law and the rule of law, states are also urged to use or continue to use international courts, in particular the International Court of Justice, as a potential tool to address shared interests of international concern. This could be seen as the application of international law to multilateralism, thereby ensuring justice and accountability in solving legal dispute. The judicial settlement of dispute in a way giving expression to Article 2, Paragraph 3, and Article 33 of the UN Charter, and reinforcing the role of international law. Secondly, a democratic world order should be centered around the principles of transparency, accountability, and inclusive participation. Democracy is not merely a system of governance, but a foundation upon which the principle of sovereign equality of states rests. Support for democratic practices and transparent processes at the international level allows for inclusive participation and ownership, and thereby putting an end to the paradigm of inequality, inequities, as well as safeguarding against the erosion of democratic tenet of sovereign equality. It is imperative for pluralism to be reinforced, allowing for the voices of all actors in international relations to be heard. Thirdly, we acknowledge that sustainability is the bedrock of a world order that promises longevity and prosperity for future generations. The 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and the Paris Agreement on Climate Change provide us the blueprint. Additionally, the Summit of the Future affords us the opportunity at the highest level to outline an ambitious agenda, not only to forge a new international consensus, but also to establish a new global agreement on multilateral solutions with a commitment to deliver a better present and safeguard the future. We must thus accelerate our efforts to combat climate change, promote sustainable development, and protect our planet's biodiversity. This includes fostering innovation in green technologies, enhancing global cooperation on environmental issues, meaningful capacity development and transfer of technology, and ensuring that economic growth does not come at the expense of our planet's health. Fourthly, it is imperative to highlight the role of the Bretton Woods institutions, the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, in creating a just, fair, and sustainable world. These institutions were established to promote international economic cooperation and stability. However, as the global economic landscape has evolved, so too must these institutions. We must ensure that their policies and practices are aligned with the principles of equity, sustainability, and democratic governance. They must assist states and government to deliver on their social contracts. Their programs must not drive a wedge between citizens and their government, exacerbating tensions that may exist. A pressing issue that requires our immediate attention is the burden of debt on developing nations. Many countries are trapped in a cycle of debt that stifle their development prospects and exacerbate poverty and inequality. Debt cancellation and comprehensive debt treatment are not just economic necessities, but means to address some of the root causes of conflicts. By providing debt relief, we enable these nations to invest in health, education, infrastructure, and sustainable development, thereby fostering global stability and prosperity. Debt sustainability should be a cornerstone of our multilateral effort. We must work towards a fair and transparent international sovereign lending and debt architecture that prevents future debt crises and ensure that borrowing is managed responsibly. This includes promoting responsible lending and borrowing practices, enhancing debt transparency, and developing mechanisms for fair and orderly debt restructuring. Mr. President, in pursuit of these goals, multilateralism is our most powerful tool. The United Nations, with its unique legitimacy and convening power, must be at the forefront of fostering international cooperation. We must reform and reinvigorate our multilateral institutions to be more effective, representative, and responsive to the needs of all member states. This includes addressing disparities in global governance structures and ensuring equitable representation for developing countries, especially Africa. Our collective resolve to enhance our multilateral cooperation must be the immediate necessity. Our inaction will have a debilitating effect on the dignity of humanity. In that regard, Sierra Leone reiterates its commitment to the principles, ideals, and objectives of the UN Charter. In closing, Mr. President, let me say that the challenges of our times are formidable, but they are not insurmountable. By embracing multilateral cooperation, we can create a world that is more just, democratic, and sustainable. Let us reaffirm our commitment to these principles and work together to build a future that reflects the highest aspiration of humanity. I thank you.
Я благодарю представителя Сьерра-Леоне.
I thank the representative of Sierra Leone. I give the floor to the representative of the Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Mr. President. It is significant and surreal that this meeting on multilateralism and the world order was convened as the signature event of the Russian presidency of the Security Council, as the country has been providing us with an almost painful amount of food for thought on this subject. With frustration from the intractable conflicts, violence, and threats to international peace and security persisting around the world, such as the war in Ukraine, the Gaza crisis, and DPRK's repeated violations of Security Council resolutions. It is often argued that the UN and multilateralism have become futile. It is truly frustrating that in practice, the UN indeed was designed to be powerless, in case a permanent member of the Security Council uses force in violation of the UN Charter and is determined to get away with it. However, this does not mean that we should give up on the UN or multilateralism. Dear colleagues, even without binding decisions, the United Nations, in particular the Security Council, still provides a valuable platform to exchange views among member states and construct the right narrative for the international community. The United Nations can serve as a megaphone that sends out clear messages toward the global audience that the violation of the UN Charter by any member states is unacceptable, thereby ultimately thwarting the ambitions of violators and guiding us in the right direction. In our view, this enduring multilateral diplomatic space is even more relevant in the deepening skepticism and chaos we face today. Against this backdrop, I'd like to highlight the following points. First, diversity must be fostered in a manner that promotes universal values. In addressing global challenges, it is critical to respect different histories, cultures, levels of economic development, and different political systems. We should always honestly listen to each other and deepen our mutual understanding. However, we should also be reminded that we are, after all, the same kind, the one humanity, even amid conflicts, wars, and extreme hate towards one another. The essence of the humanity we share transcends all other differences in culture, politics, and history. Likewise, fundamental and universal values are non-negotiable and must be upheld under any circumstances. For instance, the reported public execution of dozens of teenage students in North Korea last week for watching South Korean dramas, and the sentencing of hard labor to North Koreans for preparing their meal with bottled rice that South Korean NGOs sent over for humanitarian purposes, are simply intolerable. Such brutal acts by the regime cannot and must not be explained or understood in terms of any diversity or differences in governance. It makes no sense to preach diversity while undermining our shared universal values. Second, we should preserve and effectively utilize the multilateral tools that the UN has developed for decades and are now at our disposal. Among many, UN peace operations remain a central component in the continuum of UN responses to maintain peace and security. We strongly call for full support for these missions, both in terms of mandates and resources, to better protect civilians, prevent conflicts, establish the rule of law, and promote human rights. As mentioned in the Secretary General's new agenda for peace, the UN Security Council sanctions regimes also remain an important UN Charter instrument to address threats to international peace and security. Sanctions should be more targeted and effective, minimizing unintended humanitarian impacts. At the same time, we need to ensure that sanctions measures are effective enough to achieve their intended goal, bearing in mind that every sanctions regime has its own history and background. Undermining sanctions regimes without good reasons or for self-serving purposes, including the monitoring mechanism, can only further complicate and destabilize situations. In this connection, Russia's single-handed dissolution of the panel of experts on DPRK sanctions in April demonstrated how grave violations of Security Council resolutions by a permanent member, such as the trading of arms with North Korea, can result in the destruction of an indispensable Security Council institution. One lie leads to another, and one crime leads to another. Colleagues, this brings us to my next point, that accountability for decisions and agreements must be ensured. The concept note for today's meeting asks us whether the international order should be founded on a polycentric or a unipolar paradigm. But in our view, this question is about how we analyze an existing phenomenon, not a matter of choice. Whether we are living in a multipolar world or not, what matters is that we realize sustaining peace from it. We have seen the consequences of the multipolar order, or rather disorder, of the 1920s and 30s. It is our common goal not to let such history repeat itself. One way to achieve this goal is to ensure that the United Nations outperform the League of Nations and to stick to the rules and principles that we have agreed upon as much as possible, including the UN Charter and the Security Council resolutions. This is what we can choose. These rules should be applied to everyone in a fair and consistent manner. It must also be made clear that consequences will follow for violators, rather than allowing impunity. Only then can the rule of law be established. In particular, it is paramount that the prime principles of the UN Charter, such as the non-use of force, respect for other nations' sovereignty and territorial integrity, and the promotion of human rights, are upheld in every corner of the world without leaving any vacuum. There are no so-called legitimate concerns that justify violation of these basic principles. Colleagues, as we look ahead to the summit of the future, we do not want our present to be remembered by future generations as a dark era of multilateralism. Instead, let it be known as a key juncture when we overcame the criticism of futility against multilateralism with tenacious joint efforts to promote our shared universal values. I thank you.
Благодарю представителя республики.
I thank the representative of the Republic of Korea, and I give the floor to the United States.
Thank you, Mr. President. The United States welcomes the opportunity to come together to discuss this serious matter of international peace and security and multilateral cooperation, even if it was convened by a council member that has shown time and time again that it doesn't take this matter seriously. And in fact, as I listened to the Russian representative's statement, I thought I was in the wrong room because this seemed to be a session whining about the United States and the West, and I hardly heard the word multilateralism mentioned. Colleagues, as you all know, member states are invited to donate artwork to the United Nations, and these official gifts are meant to epitomize the ideals of the United Nations, the values outlined in its charter. You may all ask, why am I mentioning this? Well, beyond this chamber, at the easternmost edge of the United Nations North Lawn, is Russia's gift, presented in 1959. It's a bronze statue of a man beating his sword into a plowshare, transforming a weapon of war into a tool for the common good, prioritizing food security and agricultural prosperity over destruction. And so it's ironic that today, the very country that erected this statue, this statement of the UN's ideals, is now actively engaged in a war of aggression against its neighbor. A war that has weaponized food, worsening food insecurity, not only for Ukrainians, but for tens of millions of hungry people around the world. A war that has severely damaged Ukraine's power production, threatening to leave hundreds of thousands in the cold this winter. A war that has killed thousands of innocent people, including dozens just last week at a pediatric hospital in Kyiv. A war that has facilitated the unlawful transfer of thousands upon thousands of people from their homes, including children. And a war that has caused Moscow to resort to nuclear brinksmanship and to violate international sanctions obligations. Of course, Russia's abhorrent behavior began well before its full-scale invasion in 2022. In particular, Putin has treated human beings as bargaining ships and continue to do so to this day. I think about the family and friends of Trevor Reed and Brittany Griner and Evan Gershkovich and Paul Whelan, as well as others. People detained for doing their jobs or even just being in the wrong place at the wrong time and used as human pawns. Last year, this council had the privilege of being joined by Paul's sister, Elizabeth, in the public gallery. And I asked Minister Lavrov to consider her unimaginable pain, having gone 4 years without seeing her brother, to look into her eyes and see her suffering. Today, over 2,000 days since he last saw his family, Paul remains locked up in a Russian penal colony. And so, Minister Lavrov, I want to look into your eyes while you look into your phone and say, we will not rest until Paul and Evan come home. And Russia has ceased this barbaric practice of holding human pawns once and for all. And that is a promise. Colleagues, it is clear the hypocrisy displayed on the UN's North Lawn by a nation that has chosen to beat plowshares into swords is only matched by the hypocrisy it has displayed in this very council today and every day. Today, we gather under the guise of embracing and improving multilateralism, of recommitting to international law, and yet as we speak, Russia continues to erode confidence in our institutions while willfully and flagrantly violating the core tenets of the United Nations Charter: territorial integrity, respect for human rights, international cooperation. These are our values, the shared principles every single one of us agreed to uphold. And they have provided the basis of the United Nations' greatest triumphs. Our shared principles have helped us forestall nuclear proliferation and prevent mass atrocities. They have helped us forge peace after years of strife and provide desperately needed humanitarian aid to those in need. Now, let me be clear, I'm not starry-eyed. The United Nations isn't perfect. It reflects a deeply imperfect world, one filled with conflict and contradiction. The debates we have in this room exist beyond it too. And yet, this institution endures. Multilateralism endures because we need it to endure. We need an effective United Nations to tackle the kind of borderless challenges that affect us all. More than that, the United Nations endures because people and nations continue to see its promise. And even in the darkest moments of the past few years, those people, those nations have offered glimmers of hope, moments in which multilateralism won out over isolationism, hope over cynicism. And I think about the global response to Russian aggression. In the aftermath of Russia's full-scale invasion, 143 UN member states came together to affirm Ukraine's territorial integrity and sovereignty. Time and time again, the vast majority of this council has spoken out against Russia's illegal, unprovoked, unnecessary war and against all those who enable it. And in multilateral fora across the globe, including at last month's Ukraine Peace Summit in Switzerland, leaders have committed to Ukraine's recovery, reconstruction, reform, and modernization, to good faith negotiations toward a just and lasting peace, consistent with the principles of the UN Charter. In all of these efforts, the United States has been inspired by the extraordinary courage and the resilience of the Ukrainian people. Ordinary citizens willing to risk everything to protect the values they hold dear: democracy and justice, equality and humanity, peace and security. The very values we all have the privilege, in fact, the responsibility to fight for here in this chamber. Colleagues, the United Nations needs reform, not a wrecking ball, and certainly not one accompanied by mealy-mouthed calls for cooperation, but rather meaningful and positive evolution, real action